you for still being here with us. Thank you, Clara. Thank you. So yeah, we're gonna talk about this new initiative because we're not gonna talk about fundraising and the typical topics in the startup ecosystem, but we're gonna talk about Je choisis la French Tech. I choose French Tech. Can you just tell us what it is?
So this initiative we launched back in June during Vivitech this year. And it came from this simple perspective. Everyone knows 2022, and maybe it started a bit earlier, started to be a bit more difficult when it comes to financing. And a lot of startups were always saying, you know what, actually getting finance is great, getting money from the state is great, but what's even better is getting money from our customers. Which is probably true. And in the last few years, probably this very simple fact has been kind of hidden between all this very exciting momentum from a financing perspective and all the support that governments across Europe, especially here in France with the Plan France 2030, has given startups. But it is a simplest way to grow a business is to have more customers, and it's also probably the healthiest way because you're building a product that people love and you're going to grow out of that. And in those conversations with startups always came this idea that it is not that easy for a young, innovative, maybe a bit risk-taking company to find the right way to build contracts and sign those deals with big corporates and with the public sector. Whereas the public sector and big corporates are in fact the ones that can make a huge difference in the trajectory of a startup. So we came with this problem in mind, and we said, okay, how do we gather everyone in this ecosystem that goes way beyond the startup ecosystem? Big groups, corporates, public administration, ministries, smaller groups, startups themselves, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit, so that we ask them one very simple thing. How do you change your state of mind? How do you commit to choose startups first when you buy a solution? And the objective is simple, is how do we then double the part that startups represent in the way that companies and non-profit and public sector buy all the solutions they buy today. So doubling the purchase of a company towards startups in 5 years. That's the objective.
And can you just tell us a few measures, maybe the main ones?
So when then what we did was, okay, how do we get people on board? And by talking with a lot of the buyers in those big corporates or in those big administration, we came to realize that it was not only a change of mindset that was needed, but also helping all around the line so that we get to this result. And so we got around 50 institutions and maybe 200 something companies to sign when we launched the plan back in June. And to support them with the objective, we decided to focus on 3 major things. First one is, how do we help build those relationships? Because often when you ask startups, but what is preventing you from selling to one of those big corporates or big administration, and to that matter, they're quite similar, is who's the right contact? And sometimes it's who are the right contacts, because you have to see a lot of different people in the institution to get there. So that was the first thing, building those relationships through events, through individual networking session between buyers and startups, and that's taking place now very regularly. We're at the event that is called REF from the MEDEF, which is our biggest syndicate for big corporates, back in August, and we had more than 30 individual meetings with startups and big groups like Orange, our biggest telco, like EDF, which is our biggest electric provider. So all of those individual meetings are happening now. That's one. Second is training. Because you often think at this problem and you're like, oh yeah, you're going to put people in touch and that's kind of it. But you also need to train both the startup and the buyer coming from corporate or from administration, to look at each other in a way that can make the deal happen. You have to do a lot of training towards startup in understanding how to build a proposal for a big group, but also towards the buyers to look at the startup in a different way. And the third pillar is financing, because going after a solution from a startup is a risk, and we can help reduce this risk if we help finance part of it. And we are doing this obviously with a public institution more than the big groups, because the big groups have to do it by themselves. But there is a different part of the central administration which takes care of everything purchasing for the state. A lot of different mechanisms help reduce this risk. One being having a separate fund to help administration go and sign a deal with a startup. One being having a different type of process for deals that are below 100,000 euro, so that gets faster and it's easier for the buyer to go and take the risk. So, relationship, training, and financing.
And the tricky question, but is it harder to sign a contract, a deal with a corporate or with the public sector?
It's a very good question. I think you can't put all these eggs in the same basket, in a way that it goes back to what I was saying about risk-taking. And it's probably easier to sign a deal with the Ministry of Defense, because they know something about taking risks. And they're not that afraid to do that, than it is to sign a deal with a public hospital, because on the contrary, they are not here to take risks. So the feedback we gather from the startups is, depending on the actors, they have this culture of taking risk and opening up to new ideas that is inside the organization already, or that needs to be trained to do so. And the same with big groups. So it's probably easier with groups that have had a very innovative approach to seeing those new technologies, and that I have made a priority to work with startups for a long time. It would be easier to get those groups to sign deals than it would be maybe for more traditional groups. So I was not surprised, looking at very concrete example. In August, Chronopost announced that they signed a deal with e-commerce, which is a French Tech 120 company looking at e-commerce logistics. And I think La Poste has done, La Poste is our public company looking at everything postal services, but they've done a huge effort in the last decade to really onboard innovation in everything they do. And so they're probably this type of groups where you have very defined people where you can go who you can go after to make this kind of deals happen, and that's probably helping making it easier than compared to other groups.
And another tricky question, and I'll stop. But is it harder to have a contract with a French company rather than an American company? That's the thing we always hear in the ecosystem.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I do hear those things too. We don't really have data to assess if this is like what we feel is happening or what is actually happening. And that's a big part actually of the initiative that I forgot to mention. But the craziest thing that happened to us when we started looking at this problem is we asked corporates, how much do you spend towards startups? And 30%, so 1 out of 3 of the big groups that sign the commitment to double their purchasing towards startups. So they signed Je choisis la French Tech initiative. They told us, we have no idea. We don't know how to track it. We actually don't even really know what is a startup, to that matter. So a big part of the initiative is, how do we measure how companies and administration spend? And how do we get much more knowledgeable to what's causing the delays or the difficulties or everything that is preventing this to happen? And I think maybe not in the first edition, but in a second edition of what we call the observatory, a big part of it will be also to understand what is working better elsewhere, and are there some stuff that we can replicate here in France so that we can accelerate and copy the great initiative from elsewhere. So when we have those data, I'll be able to answer.
Okay, we'll see. When you launched the initiative back in June during Vivatech, there were, you said 14 institutional players and 255 companies, including 108 major groups. And now others joined the party.
Yeah, we were really excited to see that a lot of corporates, but also ministries, are reaching out to say, okay, we we understand why you're doing that, and we want to be part of it. So at the moment, I think those numbers have almost doubled. So it's 80 institutions and close to 400 companies. And it's really exciting because I think the first thing that this initiative is doing, this subject has been on the table for a decade or actually more. It's also on the table like at European level. It was part of the Scale Up Europe initiative. How do we work better with big groups? And it's been always harder for us in, for example, in the US where you have the Small Business Act to do something about it. But I think what we're doing with Je choisis la French Tech is we are getting into everyone's mind that you can make the difference at a very individual level. You as a buyer can decide to make things happen. And it's kind of a cultural shift. It was funny, earlier today I was talking with someone in the team and we launched this new program in VivaTech as well, called French Tech 2030, which is supporting a lot of very deep tech companies. A big sector in this program is cyber. A lot of startups have amazing cyber solutions, but a lot of big groups are a little bit reluctant to take this risk that we were talking about. And one of those companies told us today that they were having this big meeting with a bank, and it was not the first meeting, it was probably like they had seen different people in the bank trying to sell their solution. And at some point in the meeting, the CEO of the startup said, hey, but you signed this Je choisis la French Tech commitment, so why not do it? And actually, it unlocked something. And I hope they signed the deal, but in that meeting they told us that everyone in the room was like, okay, yeah, it's true, we made this commitment to ourselves that we're going to make this effort, so let's do it.
And do you have any new examples of signed deals that were made thanks to the initiative, one or two?
Yes, I was talking about Chronopost and e-commerce. Another one could be Alma, who's working with SNCF, which is our train. Alma is a payment solution. SNCF is our national train company. So we're seeing those type of relationship now really getting further. And this is really exciting because if all those companies can sign one of those big deals, it's also an enhancer for all the other prospects that they might have. Because if you're Alma and you can say, oh, you know what, SNCF took this risk, SNCF is one of our clients,